Welcome to the Tax Administration Lecture Series 3. My name is Vusim Caesar in the Department of Taxation. In this video lecture, we will focus on the provisions in respect of tax assessments and dispute resolutions. Secondly, the provisions in relation to the recovery of tax debts. Looking at this diagram, you will note that the recovery of tax represents one of the last enforcement measures of SARS in terms of its administrative powers. In addition, the Tax Administration Act does provide for measures that seek to protect the taxpayer or the measures in which the taxpayer can have recourse against an administrative action that has been undertaken by SARS in pursuit of its mandate. So in the event that perhaps the taxpayer is aggrieved by an administrative action that has been undertaken by SARS or failure to implement an administrative action, therefore the Tax Administration Act does provide guidance as to how the taxpayer can have recourse or the taxpayer can actually safeguard or protect their rights, therefore, in terms of the constitution of the land. Simply put, these taxpayer remedies are there to ensure a just administrative action or to ensure a just relation between SARS and the taxpayers. As we move on, we look at the provision for tax assessments. Section 91 to Section 100 of the Tax Administration Act provides for the making of various assessments by the South African Revenue Services. Moving on, the provision for tax assessments has been provided for under Section 91 to Section 100 of the Tax Administration Act, which provides for the making of these various assessments by the South African Revenue Services in its carrying out of the mandate of collecting maximum tax revenue from the taxpaying community. The majority of these assessments are based on or are made in reference to the information that has been submitted in the return for tax by various taxpayers, or any other information that is available to the Revenue Office. After the making of these assessments, SARS will then issue a notice of assessment that reflects the amount of tax liability that is payable by the taxpayer or the amount of tax that is refundable to the taxpayer. As mentioned before, one of the powers available to the South African Revenue Services in the issuing of the tax assessments arise out of Section 94 of the Tax Administration Act. In accordance with this section, SARS has the power to make or to issue a jeopardy assessment. That is, if SARS has any reasonable grounds or suspicion to believe that the recovery of tax may be in jeopardy. Simply put, this refers to any suspicion or a doubt that a taxpayer may be making plans to avoid the payment of tax, or that the taxpayer perhaps is trying to dissipate their assets in order to avoid the payment of tax. Next, we look at the Section 95 of the Tax Administration Act, which empowers the South African Revenue Services to make any assessment at any point in time based on only an estimate. An assessment that is based on an estimate normally is driven by the conduct of the taxpayer. In an event where a taxpayer fails to submit a return for tax, maybe for a couple of years, or a taxpayer continuously submits incorrect information or inadequate information, SARS has a power in accordance with this section to use any information available at its disposal to actually make or raise an assessment on behalf of the taxpayer. In addition, SARS can then levy a fixed amount penalty for any non-compliance by the taxpayer to any of these obligations. This has been provided for under Section 210 to 212 of the Tax Administration Act. Secondly, Section 213 and 214 of the Tax Administration Act also empowers the South African Revenue Services to levy a percentage-based penalties for any non-compliance by the taxpayer to any of these obligations. Lastly, Section 21 to Section 24 of the Tax Administration Act also empowers the South African Revenue Services to impose an understatement penalty for any non-compliance by the taxpayer. The understatement penalty relates to the tax that would have been paid or the tax that would have been payable had the correct information been submitted by the taxpayer. Moving on to the taxpayer remedies, as mentioned before, the Tax Administration Act also provides for protection of the taxpayer against any abuse of public power by the South African Revenue Services. In terms of Section 216 to Section 220 of the Tax Administration Act, it is provided that an unsatisfied or an aggrieved taxpayer may request the South African Revenue Services to remit one or more penalties that have been imposed for any non-compliance by the taxpayer. Obviously, there would be terms and conditions attached. Chapter 9 of the Tax Administration Act, specifically Section 101 to Section 150, provides for a detailed outline of processes and procedure that are available to any taxpayer who is aggrieved by an assessment or a decision of the Commissioner for South African Revenue Services. Looking at the remedies available to the taxpayer against the imposition of penalties or interest by the South African Revenue Services. Section 216 to Section 220 of the Tax Administration Act provides for an aggrieved taxpayer to request a remission of one or more penalties that were imposed by the South African Revenue Services for any non-compliance by or on the part of the taxpayer. Obviously, this will be subject to terms and conditions that need to be met, both on the side of the South African Revenue Services and on the part of the taxpayer. Next in the focus of the lecture is the provision for recovery of taxes or the timely payment of taxes that are due. Section 162 of the Tax Administration Act provides that a tax must be paid by the day and at the place notified by the Commissioner for SARS as a single amount or in terms of installment payment arrangement made or entered into by the taxpayer and the South African Revenue Services senior official. In the event that the Commissioner for SARS has some suspicion or reasonable grounds to believe that a taxpayer will not pay the full amount of tax by the deadline, or a taxpayer will try and dissipate his or her assets, or the recovery may become difficult in the near future, the Commissioner for SARS is empowered to require a full payment of the amount assessed or the tax due immediately upon the receipt of the notice of assessment, or to pledge sufficient security for the payment of the tax amount outstanding, or pledge a sufficient security for the payment of the amount of the tax debt outstanding. Looking deeper into the administrative powers available to SARS. Under Section 163 of the Tax Administration Act, SARS is permitted to authorize any application to a High Court for an order of preservation of the taxpayer's assets or to prohibit any person, including the taxpayer, from dealing in the assets that are subject to a preservation order. Additionally, under Section 164 of the Tax Administration Act, SARS has a right to receive and recover any tax amount or any tax debt due, despite any ongoing dispute undertaken by the taxpayer on any assessment or on any decision of the South African Revenue Services. This principle is also known as the Pay Now Accumulator Principle. Section 172 to Section 176 of the Tax Administration Act also empowers the South African Revenue Services to file a certified statement or to apply for a civil judgment in an effort to recover any tax that is due or any tax that is outstanding, irrespective of whether or not the amount of that tax in question is subject to any objection or an appeal by the taxpayer. Under Section 177 and 178 of the Tax Administration Act, SARS is also empowered to institute proceedings of sequestration, proceedings of liquidation, and proceedings of winding up of any taxpayer estate or taxpayer assets in pursuit of a tax debt. The Commissioner for SARS or a senior SARS official is also empowered to collect any tax debt outstanding from third parties connected with the taxpayer under Section 179 or to Section 184 of the Tax Administration Act. As mentioned before, the Tax Administration Act also provides for remedies to the taxpayer to safeguard against any abuse of the administrative powers available to the South African Revenue Services. Therefore, under Section 164 of the Tax Administration Act, a taxpayer can or may apply for a suspension of an obligation to pay a tax. As a condition to this remedy, the taxpayer must have an intention to dispute the liability to pay such a tax, and the dispute must have been initiated by the taxpayer. Section 164 of the Tax Administration Act also permits a taxpayer to enter into an installment payment arrangement with the South African Revenue Services in respect of any tax debt that is outstanding. The taxpayer may also request a temporary or a permanent write-off of a tax debt under Section 195 to Section 199 of the Tax Administration Act. The Tax Administration Act under Section 200 to Section 205 also permits or allows the taxpayer to request a compromise of an outstanding tax debt. Lastly, it is important to note that these taxpayer remedies are not automatic, and they are subject to terms and conditions. If any of those conditions are not met, SARS has a right to disallow a request for such a remedy, or SARS may disallow a request for such a remedy. But that will not be the end of the remedies available to the taxpayer. The taxpayer can still pursue that particular dispute or pursue the protection of their right via the courts of law. Unfortunately, unlike the internal processes within the South African Revenue Services, which are free, any proceedings or any legal proceedings that is undertaken by the taxpayer in the formal courts of law will have cost implications for the taxpayer. That means that the taxpayer will have to then make payments for lawyers, or payments for legal advice, or payments for legal representations in those legal proceedings. Lastly, we have attached this dispute resolution flowchart for your information. It's for you to determine how to go about lodging a dispute, or how to go about assisting a taxpayer in lodging their dispute against any decision of the South African Revenue Services or any decision against an assessment issued by the South African Revenue Services. Thank you so much for your attention. Please let us know in the comment sections as to how else can we improve your learning experience. Thank you. Bye.